Hello fellow glue sniffers and sprue snippers, and thank you for joining us again at Blitzkrieg Model Works. Sorry, something in my throat. I'm Bob, you know me as Darkland on the forums. Hey, terribly sorry, I did try to get a video up a few days ago with the same time as the Stug Life group build announcement I did. Unfortunately, something screwed up with the video, and I did an assembly of the lower hull, which I've since painted and done some putty filling and whatnot. For some bizarre reason, even though the camera was set up the same way it is right now, and the Stug Life one turned out just fine, the one for this went vertical. And those of you who do YouTube videos, you know in your video creator, you can flip your video. Well, it turned my video from what you see here to about this. And there was nothing I could do. When I flipped it back to vertical, it went full size again. But it was vertical, and it was really annoying to see, you know, my hands working from the side, and it looked really weird. And try as I might, I couldn't fix it, so I ended up just deleting the video, and I'll try and do a bit of an overview and catch up, and we'll do a bit of work on the turret here. So last time we had assembled the lower hull with all the running gear. I have since painted the running gear and the lower hull. I have done the seam work, as you can see here. Oh, focus, 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 focus. Doesn't want to focus. It's funny, I was doing it before. And you can see we did some work there. This is worked out really well. We attached all the loose tools, filling in some of the pinholes with putty, and then adzing or scraping them clean, and a little bit of sanding with our nail files. And when we put these in place, I used a combination. Some I used the Tamiya Extra Thin, and some I used my MEK, methyl ethyl ketone, which I used for years until the Tamiya Extra Thin came out. And realistically, I found virtually no difference between the two. So everything was basically, the tools were put into place, kind of positioned, and then a dab of glue at each connector, and it's done. And then you just leave it and let it dry. And now they're all very, very well secured in place. Well, that one not quite so much, but the tail end is fine. There are a couple of other pieces to put on the top. Some I'm not going to do until the very end. Things like the driver's mirrors. As you can see, they're rather small, and the mounts are rather fragile. They require a little bit of cleanup. I don't know if this thing will show. There's a huge plug in here. I don't know what it is with YouTube's capture. It won't focus when it's recording, but it focuses fine when you're not recording. It's really annoying. So those have to go on. As I said, I painted the road wheels and the lower hull. The instructions call for olive drab, but because of the weathering that I'm going to be doing, I actually used Tamiya NATO green. It's XF67 for those that need a part number. It is a little bit on the light side. If I compare it to olive drab, it is quite substantially darker. You can see that's a dab of the paint, and it's quite a bit darker. But once I get it weathered, it'll look fine. If I'd used the olive drab, it would actually look kind of dark, and considering I'm putting it in a snow setting and snow cam, I wanted things to be a little on the lighter side. We did have some sinkholes to fill in a little bit. Did those up. I just have to paint the road wheels. There's rubber on the road wheels. Stupid thing won't focus. Maybe out to here. Didn't bother painting the front of this one because the tracks are going to be over it, so that's not going to be a problem. And then this will all get masked up once it's weathered up, and then we'll put the side skirts on. And I'll do a little recording of that to show you how to fill those horrible seams in. Oh, I talked about that in the video that didn't work out. If you look at the instructions, it's really amazing they didn't even bother to fix this in the instructions. This is the instructions for the lower hull parts. This is what happens when you put the side skirts on. These are supposed to be sponson storage, so they're little storage boxes on the side and air intakes or exhausts, and there's huge friggin' gaps everywhere. So we're going to fill that in. We're not going to use putty, we're not going to use super glue, we're going to use sheet styrene. It's a little more efficient in this particular application to do that. So we're going to take care of that. Not going to bother too much with the lower hull because that's effectively done other than a few little parts. We're going to work on the turret. So the first part is assembling the whole turret. So I've kind of Betty Crockered that, and it's done. Already filled in some of the gaps and seams. Already assembled the 120 mil gun barrel. I've already taken care of sanding down the seam on the top of the barrel, and this is why a lot of guys want one-piece barrels, or guys get metal barrels or resin barrels, or why some companies are now coming out with slide molded barrels. So there's actually the barrel, instead of being pieced in half, it's actually pieced as an inner and outer core, and it comes out and there's no seams, it's perfectly straight. But this is fairly easy. I'll show you how to take care of this and, you know, keep it round. So I didn't do the bottom, so I'll show you how to do that. One of the problems that I had when I was doing some test fitting is the upper turret and the lower turret went together quite well, but then there's a back bustle that goes on. This is actually part of the upper, and the bustle goes around the back, on the sides, and across the bottom. Now, while the sides were not too bad either way, I did sand off some locating mounts for the smoke dischargers, but there's just enough left there so I know where to put them. The big problem that I had was the bottom, and that's a lot of filling to have to do. It's very thin. It's probably not even a millimeter in the thickest pot, but there's a lot of filler, and this is not just Tamiya putty. This is layers of Tamiya putty sanded down nice and thin, super glue hardened, sanded down nice and thin, some more putty, oh, not quite enough, a little bit more super glue, oh, not quite enough, and then finally I did some puttying and some final super gluing today. So that's all nice and smooth. Normally I wouldn't be overly concerned about something like that if I was doing like a shelf queen where the turret's going to sit pretty much, you know, straight onto the hull, but because I'm going to do kind of a, you know, a small diagram, more of a vignette, you know, I'm going to have it off to the side, so you're definitely going to see that. So I got to make sure that that's taken care of. Now, for those of you that are interested, this little device is a lovely little vise that I use, and I use this just for turrets. You can get these now. I think Trumpeter actually sell them. I got this thing like probably 15 years ago from Lee Valley Tools here in Canada. I think they were selling it as a watchmaker's vise, which is what you'd probably normally use it for. I'm sure there's tons of uses for it, but I use it for turrets because it holds it in place, and I have an old thing of a super glue holder, and it actually just kind of fits nice and tight in there, so I can handle it. You know, if I'm painting, I can then hold it and not have any problems with it. It did come with a handle that just screws into the hole in the bottom. I've seen some now that actually come with a mount, so you can actually bolt it to a surface. I'm sure there's lots of different applications for these things. So, other than that, the turrets is basically, that's 3 pieces. There's a 4th piece, which is the gun mantlet that just, unlike most model tanks, where the mantlet gets attached to something called a trunnion, so it actually moves up and down, back and forth. This just glues right in, and that's all she wrote. There is no elevation, no depression. So it's fixed, and it's fixed at a kind of an elevated, probably maybe 5-degree elevated position, so it doesn't look too bad. It gives you a little bit of visual interest. Now, for doing a rounded part to get the seam off, we have a couple of different options. You can try adzing with a knife. And if you remember the previous video, adzing is just scraping. You can use it to scrape putty off. A bit heavy there. You can use it to scrape putty off, and it works. The problem is anything you scrape, that's a flat spot. You could use a rounded blade. Let's see, one of these. This is another scalpel blade. I think this is a number 12. And that helps a little bit. it's not as easy to do, and it's not mounted in a frame. I don't really like doing that, except maybe on the very tips of the muzzles where I need a lot more control because I don't want to round the tip over. What I will usually use is a fingernail file, and we use our very deadly dihydrogen monoxide, commonly known as tap water, and I use a small grit. These don't actually have a grit on them. It just says teardrop, medium, ultrafine. Oh, it does say it's 320 grit. Read the fine print. And very lightly go in a circular pattern while you're rotating. You don't have to rotate all that quickly. But you just go back and forth. If you get some spots, like I had a little trail there all by itself, just very lightly let the tool do the work for you. You don't have to press hard. You're not in a race. When you get up to a hard part like here with the smoke evacuator or the fume extractor, whatever you want to call it, this device on the real gun is part of a device that helps suck the spent fumes after firing the shell, so you have all this burnt powder fume in there, and it actually ejects it out the end, so the crew doesn't have to inhale it all. Just rotate back and forth. If you put it on a little heavy in one spot, don't be afraid to just very lightly sand that spot a little longer, go back and forth. And then once you're up against a square spot like that, just as long as you're rotating the barrel and you're not pressing too hard, because otherwise you might make a ridge right where your file ends. And just go back and forth and back and forth. Now it'll build up a bit of a slurry, which depending on the brand of putty you decide to use may be a little difficult to see. So you just clean that off with some tissue or paper towel, and you just keep going. Now I did the top first because the top's a little more difficult because the fume extractor has this bump, and plus there's the laser designator on the front, which is used with the aiming system to help compensate for barrel droop or barrel rise. As the barrel fires, it gets hot and it wants to warp. So the laser helps compensate for that to make sure that the gunner is always on target. And honestly, this bottom part is way easier to do than the top one was. The top one was a bit of a nightmare. The barrel halves didn't line up 100%. I did try to make the bottom one a little bit better for you guys, so you weren't sitting here watching me sand and sand and sand and sand and sand. But there you go. It's a little bit more in the front, but that's pretty much it. There's not much to do. With gun barrels, you got to be fairly careful how you sand. You don't want this to be flat, and as well in a section like this, you don't want to sand this down so it's nice and same amount of putty all the way along, because what can happen then is when you look at it from the side, you'll have this little bow that you've sanded out of the gun. And you do the same thing all the way along. There's, in this particular gun, there's a little bit of detail, and unfortunately because this thing won't focus properly. Oops, where are we? Yeah, it's not going to focus. There's kind of little indentations here that replicate bolts, and I tried not to get any putty into them. I did on the top, so I did have to use a very, very small drill bit. You can get these. Very, very small drill bits. I'm missing a few. I have to get a hold of Model Mark or somebody and get some replacements. And I didn't even put them in the drill bit or in the chuck, the 3-jaw chuck. You usually get them as a set with one of these. I just did it by hand and cleaned it out. What's a little more difficult is when you're trying to get them out of ridges. Where are we? Ridges like this. It's a little more difficult. I'm just going to try and refocus this just real quick. Okay, it did not want to focus. Sorry about that. I'll have to try something else later. But at any rate, there's a couple of ridges here. And what they do, I don't think you can really make it out. There's a little bit of fabric in between the gun barrel and where it meets the gun mantlet, excuse me, where it plugs into the front of the gun. And that's to allow the barrel to, when it fires, to recoil. So say it would go boom like that. And this is a dust cover that allows it, you know, it keeps mud and crap out and allows the gun to freely move when it recoils. There's no texture on it. There's a little bit of molding where it's supposed to look like it's wrinkled. I believe it's actually kind of a vinylized fabric that the real gun uses. And then these bands are supposed to be like basically a hose clamp type of assembly that would hold it in place. To clean up around that, there's a couple of different things you can do. Adzing works not too badly. Again, you can kind of scrape away because again, unless you're going to start cutting these up, it's going to be really hard to get in here and do this. So you can adze and be very careful about it. How I like to do it if I'm adzing is I'll actually take the knife and line it up as best as I can with the ridge, and as straight as I can do it, kind of roll it across and make a mark on either side like that. And then very carefully, and you got to use a sharp knife for this, just kind of go in and very carefully, again while you're rocking it so you don't make a flat spot, you cut that piece out just like that, and then you can add the rest. Again, you're doing the same thing. Just have to be kind of careful how you do it. And even then, it doesn't clean it up very well. What you can do is you can adze it in a different direction and do it lightly, trying not to put the tip of the knife into the plastic. It's really hard to do. It's very difficult to control. So that's where we get another secret weapon out of the tickle trunk. Dental tools. I know this may freak a few people out, but model building is one of the few hobbies where you can actually use these. Don't know what this one was actually originally for. Got this from a dentist I knew many years ago, and I have reprofiled the tips to actually for this type of application, but to also scribe sheet styrene. So if you wanted to scribe panel lines or cut fairly thick sheet styrene, and here's an example, a nice big heavy sheet of sheet styrene, and you say, well, I only need a few millimeters off the end of this, and I'm not going to be able to cut it with a knife. You use a scriber, and you just cut in, and you cut, 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 and if you can see it, it's actually on the ruler here, there's little curly cues, and that takes it out. And just that little bit, I've gone through about half on this side. It's not as deep on this side, so you have to come down and do the same thing on that side. So you can do the same thing on here, just not be so heavy-handed, and you can just very carefully scribe. And I do one side, and I do the other side, because there's a very thin gap in between these two. It's maybe about 1 millimeter, or 1/16 of an inch or so for us, our American friends. And even then, I still need to get in with a sharp knife and cut, cut, cut. And that's basically how you do it. It's tedious, it takes a while, next to the monotony of assembling a couple of dozen road wheels in some cases. Probably the one thing a lot of guys hate working on is gun barrels, because it's such a pain in the butt, which is why a lot of guys will tend to try to go with a metal barrel, you know, spend the 20 bucks, 25, 30 bucks, whatever it costs to get a metal barrel. Because then you don't do, you know, you might have to do some minor assembly, but it all just slips together with a little bit of super glue, and then it's like click, done. And it looks way better than the kit stuff does most of the time. So as far as the rest of the turret goes, I'm just reviewing my roadmap here. We have quite a few things. There's the gunner's sight, which actually comes in 2 pieces here. And I'm going to try and, you can probably see that. There's a really nasty sink mark in the back of that. So we'll fix that up with super glue. I'll do it while we film so you guys can actually see how fast this is, but also how hard the super glue is to do as well. There's going to be some cleaning up. These are hand holds to help the crew get up. These go on the front, the very front, the small cheek pieces. These go on the sides. There's these are the tops of the commanders and loaders cupolas. Unfortunately, one is really good. The other one is Sinkhole City. That one that my finger's on right there, it's pretty nasty. That's going to be a wee bit more difficult, especially to try and keep it even, but again, there's a cheat for that. There's a cheat for everything if you're patient enough and imaginative enough. Just trying to figure out here. There's a lot of little handles, which some of them are on here, some of them are not. Put that away. Don't need that. That. So I'll try and use our Tamiya super extra thin, or just, sorry, extra thin. And grab our sprue cutter. And we'll just do snip, snip. Those 2 come off. Now there's a little bit of a plug. You don't have to pull it, take it off if you don't want to, because it plugs inside the vehicle. And I'm not going to actually install this today because there's a seam that goes all the way around. We first do a dry fit like this. Take the 2 pieces and put them together and see how they fit. And overall fit's nice. Oh, there's a sink mark right in the top as well. I don't know if you can, there we go. There's a good, that's okay because we're going to have to take care of the seam around the sides as well. So that's doing the seam isn't too difficult. What we do is we'll just open this puppy up just a little bit, put in a little zap of glue and let capillary action suck the glue in, and we close it. And you don't have a whole heck of a lot of time to line things up. There and there. And done. We'll let that sit for a few minutes. So the next thing we do is there's some lifting and stowage hook arrangements. They're a little delicate to be using the cutters for. So we have these 4 pieces. Excuse me. For as much rain as we've got, it's awfully dry in my shop. So I'm just trying to figure out where the heck everything's supposed to go here. Okay, so these are lifting hooks. This would be for manufacturing or Sorry, this should be for manufacturing or maintenance. There's 3, one here, one here. We're gonna have to open these holes up a little bit, and then a third one here, and then there's like a little tie down hook here for equipment or foliage. The idea behind this is with the proper rated chain and hoist, you can actually pull the entire turret right out of the vehicle, take it off to the side, set it on a work stand, so you can work on the lower hull in one section and work on the turret in the other. So, using the same type of technique, just on a smaller scale, we do our adzing or scraping. These are a rounded unit. Not like totally rounded, but there is a bit of a curve to it, so you want to be very careful. Basically, as soon as the seam line has disappeared, or the mold seam has disappeared, you stop. Doing the inside is a lot more fun, because you don't want to squeeze this together because it'll break. So you gotta, we're gonna switch to an X-Acto because the blade profile is a lot narrower, and this blade is very sharp because I hardly ever use it. Just like so. And like so. And that's it. That's all there is to this one. So we just very carefully do put a little drop inside each hole. That one leaked right through, and there we go. Now if you want to use tweezers, if it makes you feel comfortable, feel free. Plug, it goes in. Press it all the way down, wiggle it around a little bit, make sure the plastic gets nice and seated nicely, and then set everything up, make sure it's nice and straight, front to back, side to side. One thing I should have mentioned before I put in, not applicable in this case, but it will be for this particular unit, make sure you get your orientation right. In this case, there is a front and a back. The narrow part actually goes to the back with these, with these lift hooks, whoops, on the sides. It doesn't matter, they can go in either way. So I like to adze down the attachment point first and work on the rest. And for those that wonder, have I ever cut myself doing stuff like this? Oh yeah, super glue is used for a lot more than just gluing models together. If you've watched my beginner's tool list video, you'll understand why I do things like this and why I have oval handles. They tend not to roll off the workbench, and if they don't roll off the workbench, you are not instinctively trying to catch them between your legs, which is not very advantageous if you are like me and you're allergic to pain. Almost launched that across the room. Now, if you're not comfortable with doing this and you have some small files, some needle files, such as, there we go. You know, you can get these at your hobby shop too. They're usually fairly inexpensive. You can certainly, you know, file that out. You just do it lightly. You don't have to press very hard. Most of the time, you just give it enough pressure to let the tool do the work, and that's that. Now this side, I don't know how well you can see it. The holes are, they're there, but this mold doesn't seem to, it either was very old when I got this and very well worn, or it wasn't very well made in the first place. Judging from all the tooling marks I'm seeing everywhere, it's, I'd guess, the latter. So we got a couple of holes here that we have to open up a little bit, not a lot. So what we want to do is we want to take the tip of a knife and just stick it in and rotate it just a little bit. Again, let the weight of the tool do the work. I am not pushing down at all. And there we go, done. Again, little dab will do ya. That's a fair bit of glue, but it will blend the seams in quite nicely. And there we go. That one's done. Front lift hook. Sorry, I keep doing this off camera. If you notice with this, the tip is missing off of this. I usually inadvertently end up breaking the tips off of these within about 5 minutes of putting them in. I don't tend to use the tips on these Olfas all that much. If I need a knife with a sharp tip, I still prefer the X-Actos. I just find the X-Actos, they go dull really fast. These seem to hold their edge a lot longer. You could certainly resharpen them. You'd be hard pressed to get a factory edge again. It'd be very difficult. Not impossible, but considering the cost of the blades, I haven't priced out X-Acto knife blades in a long time, but at one point they were running like, in Canada it was like $1/4 a blade, which doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're going through a couple or three per model kit, that's kind of getting up there, you know, considering this has lasted. Let's see, I've done a Dragon JS1, an Academy K200, and this kit, and the Bronco one that, you know, I kind of talked about a little bit in the Stug of Life, and so far, other than it's missing the tip, there's nothing wrong with it. So again, we want to double check our orientation, and the slanted part goes towards the inside of the turret, and we have a bit of a misfit. There we go. Now this one's kind of prominent because you gotta look straight at it, so you want to make sure that this thing is straight up and down and not cockeyed. That looks pretty good. Now there's a U-tie down. This one's going to be a bit of a pain to work on, but this is pretty much all there is really to do on the turret. There's this piece. There's a couple of other handles that go in the back. You put those on the same way, except there's no locating holes. There are, and I know you probably can't see this, well, maybe you can. There's 3 little marks here. Those are locating marks, and there's 2 here and 2 here, and that's where, I'm trying to get the reflection to see that, that's where you put the handles. So stuff like that I prefer to do last, because once I put them in, they kind of have to sit there. There's nothing really holding them on except the chemical fusion, the welding of action of the glue to the plastic. So they're just there. Certainly if you want to try something more advanced and use some bent copper or brass wire and use the drill bits and drill holes and make your own handles, because then you don't have to do this kind of stuff. All the adzing and cleaning up, you certainly can do that, but most beginners aren't going to bother with that. And that's why we, you know, in cases like this and what you're seeing here, that's why we say do not use tube glue, do not use tube glue, do not use tube glue. The stuff is horrible. It's for kids. Even kids shouldn't use that stuff. It's just horrible. It's horrible to deal with. But effectively doing the turret, it's just more of the same. It's a lot of touching this up, touching that up, doing other things. We'll put that here, because this should be nice, and yeah, that's not going anywhere. So I promised I was going to show you this. So you don't need to do any prep work. Super glue tends to stick right there, so just put a small drop in, and kind of spread it around so it's nice and even. You don't want to go over the edge, because you're just going to have to clean that up. But this, spreading around like that makes it nice and even, and it's the less you have to sand off a hump, and then you might not have enough on the edges, and you'll have to do it again. So I'll go to dab, and we wait a second, literally a second, and we clean it up, and we're done. Oops. Again, we have hydrogen monoxide. Now this time we're going to start with the coarse side. Oops. Now, one of the problems with working with super glue doing this is you have to stop and clean the slurry off quite a bit, not to just keep it from fouling up your tool, but so you can see what you're doing. When you're using like gray or white or green putty, you can fairly easily see your progress when you stop and do this. When you're using super glue, because it's clear, you really have no idea where you are in the sanding process. And on a part this small, you want them, and prominent, because it's going like, literally this part goes right here. So it's a fairly prominent part. And you want to make sure that it's not rounded if it's supposed to be flat. And I can see that because of the way I'm sanding, it's going a little bit round. But we'll start with the finishing side. So this is our 320 grit. Up. That's much finer. Now the scratch marks that the 320 make will be completely covered by the plastic, or by the paint, sorry. Or primer if you choose to use primer. Usually I don't use primer. Some guys really like using primer. Some guys don't. I'm kind of hit and miss. Sometimes I will, sometimes I won't. Kind of depends what my end game for the project is. Kind of weathering purposes, things I'm going to have to do. So there we go. It's pretty much done. A few more strokes. I'm not going to do too much until I wait for the glue to dry enough to do the sides. Because there's I don't doubt you can see this, but the tooling marks on the sides are really hard. They're really brutal. So this is going to take a fair bit of cleanup. And then the biggest thing other than that with the turret is all the smoke launchers. There is 2, 4, 6, 8, 16 of them, plus frames. So there's 8 on each side, and they're in 2-step racks, like this and this. I know from looking at pictures of the real thing, there's lots of detail we could throw in there, because they're all wires and all, all the electrical and the chains and everything that hold the caps on that. We're not going to do any of that because this is just a basic kit. It's going to be a little bit more involved in that, and what I'll do is I'll shoot a separate separate video showing a quick install of how that's done. Doing this turret ring, or cupola ring I should say, what you can do in this case where you have a flat surface with multiple sinkholes, because the sinkholes are caused by these supports. When they cool, they suck the plastic down, and there's basically a sinkhole on each one. So there's 2, 4, 6, 7 of them, and it's what makes it more of a challenge is this opening that makes it really flexible. But what you can do is, I'm going to use the Tamiya putty, because it'll be a lot easier to sand. It's not as hard to sand as super glue is. And when it's done, I'm going to get out a sheet of sandpaper and sand it. But to keep it flat, there's a little trick. You sand it in a figure-8 pattern. So instead of sanding it like this or like this, you sand it like this. And that way you're putting even pressure all the way around because of the way you're changing direction and the like. And you can even change the orientation every once in a while. It won't take much because you want to make this nice and flat. You don't want to round over the edges of this. You want it to be, nice and sharp. On the real thing, it would be a little bit rounded, but for this scale, it would be pretty much razor sharp almost. So that's how we do that up and get it mounted in. And that's basically it for installation, other than the tracks which if you remember, I had some problems with the heat sealing not taking, so we ended up having to staple. This will go on the top run, so you won't really, it'll go underneath the sponson, so you'll only see this bottom part. And then, I still have to paint and weather, and all these track shoes are going to have to be, kind of a blackish gray or grayish black, I guess, with some dark metallic color in here. The tracks don't really rust if you really look at them. They tend to get kind of a dark metallic gray, and I guess there's a really deep red brownish tone to them, but you don't see like bright rust on tracks. I've actually got a set of Canadian Dale tracks from a Canadian 113 here in the shop, and they're beat to crap. They were going into the recycle bin when they were gifted to me, but they look there's not really rust when you shrink it down. Certainly when you're looking at it, oh yeah, they're kind of rusty, but when you shrink it down to this scale, no, they wouldn't be rusty at all. You'd see kind of a dark reddish brown on a blackish gray. So that's about it. When I come back, we'll do kind of a final assembly with a few little bit videos showing how to assemble and put all the little parts on here, so we speed things up a little bit. Hopefully it won't take too long. We're set at almost half an hour, 26 minutes. Wow. But thanks anyway. Thanks for putting up with me. If you have any comments, please put them in the comment section below. I do read all of them. You can message me here or on Google+. And please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching.